If it takes a Nassau bill to do it, then I invite my GOP colleagues to boldly go where none of them have ever gone before, to planet Earth on a mission to defend the voting rights of the people.
They took two bills, two dangerous bills, HR1, the For the Politicians Act, and HR4, and created a love child. They took an old NASA bill and gutted it, and then tucked all of this egregious language into the NASA bill. So it was like NASA Infrastructure Act or something, and has nothing to do with NASA. We are not giving voting rights to Martians today. Even though what we voted on was a NASA bill, it was actually a federal takeover of elections. That right there ought to tell you, if they cannot even name the bill, they have to gut another bill and then tuck their egregious, horrific language into it. That tells you that they're trying to hide something.
Colleagues object to guaranteeing the people's right to vote through the vehicle of a NASA bill, of all things. You know, a quarter century ago, Republicans changed Texas state law to permit astronauts to vote absentee from space. They want to make it easier to vote from space, and they want to make it harder to vote on Earth. GOP gerrymandering of our districts, right-wing court packing and judicial activism to destroy the Voting Rights Act in cases like Shelby County versus Holder and Brnovich, and deployment of the filibuster to block voting rights legislation. The whole matrix of GOP democracy suppression today. It's time to protect the right to vote here on Earth. If it takes a Nassau bill to do it, then I invite my GOP colleagues to boldly go where none of them have ever gone before, to planet Earth on a mission to defend the voting rights of the people.
But the things that you need to know that are the most egregious are that it is 100% a mechanism to strip states' rights to enforce voter ID laws. But the things that you need to know that are the most egregious are that it is 100% a mechanism to strip states' rights to enforce voter ID laws. Also in this bill is ballot harvesting. Third-party groups that are paid for by political entities and political parties now can collect ballots and then turn them in. And this bill actually makes it so that states cannot ban ballot harvesting. This bill allows non-citizens to vote. Think about the travesty that is happening at our southwest border. 1.7 million just last year, and it's getting worse. I talked to Border Patrol agents just yesterday. It is getting worse.
Now, we've heard in New York, Democrats recently voted to allow foreign citizens to vote in American elections. You heard it right. It's a blatantly unconstitutional scheme that defies the most basic rule of our system. Hey, 7th grade civics, American elections should be decided by American citizens. The truth is, Georgia's law has more days of early in-person voting than Joe Biden's own home state of Delaware. The 2020 election saw the highest turnout of voters in 120 years. And according to the Pew Research Center, 94% of Americans agree it is, quote, easy to vote. Voter registration disparities between minority and non-minority voters in states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana are below, listen, the disparities are below the national average and lower than Democrat-run states like New York, California, and Delaware. That's the facts. For Democrats, the only problem they're seeking to solve is the problem of how to secure for themselves more votes.
The other thing that I think is the most egregious, and this is why I need you guys to help me spread the word about this. And I'm going to use AOC as an example. This is public financing of campaigns. And you're probably like, what does that mean, Kat? Why is that a problem? Let me tell you why that's a problem. Because the way this bill is written, you now, and you being the taxpayer, me being a taxpayer, we are on the hook. One match for donations to politicians that are $200 or less. And you're probably like, well, why does that matter, Kat? Let me put this in perspective. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, from New York, is when you have a politician like AOC who raises approximately $19 million in what is called small dollar donations. That puts us in a 6-to-1 match, which means you and me We don't agree with her, we don't like her, but now we're on the hook to finance her campaign to the tune of $113 million. $113 million. If you have $113 million in your re-election campaign, you're going to be in Congress forever. Every state has 2 senators. So that means you have 2 phone calls to make. You get to call your senators and you get to tell them that 1, you want the filibuster to stay in place. 2, you want them to vote no on the so-called Voting Rights Act. So-called Voting Rights Bill, everybody knows what it is. It's a NASA bill. You could say NASA bill and they're gonna be like, oh yeah, that's the Voting Rights Bill. Because somehow they can't pass it under the name voting rights because we all know what they're trying to do. So they got a NASA bill and they use that as the shell. Remember, guys, what this bill does. It publicly finances campaigns. It allows non-citizens to vote. It encourages ballot harvesting. It strips voter ID requirements. All the things that are basic common sense. When you call them, you give them your name, you give them your phone number, you tell them you're a resident of the state, whatever state you're in. You tell them you want a response. Because it's very important to tell your representatives that you want a response. If you don't tell them explicitly, I want a response, they're never going to respond to you. So give them a way to communicate back to you, be it a phone number, be it an email, an address for snail mail.
Just this morning, we learned that inflation rose 7% over the past year. It's the highest rate since 1982. We have empty shelves. We have unfilled jobs due to labor shortages across the country. Schools are shutting down again. Crime is soaring in our cities, and faith in our institutions is in rapid decline. And what are Washington Democrats focused on? They want to blow up the rules of Congress so they can pass their extremist agenda to federalize local elections, legalize ballot harvesting, ban voter ID requirements, fund their own campaigns with precious taxpayer dollars. It is truly unbelievable to the people back home. Chuck Schumer says this is a response to the 2020 election and the state election laws passed in 2021. That's obviously not a true statement because the bill they're peddling was first introduced, in 2019. Joe Biden says it's to stave off the reemergence of a second Jim Crow era in states like Texas and Georgia, which passed election integrity measures this year. But that's a ridiculous charge. I mean, literally, it is the opposite of the facts that any person can verify with a single internet search. The truth is, Georgia's law has more days of early in-person voting than Joe Biden's own home state of Delaware. The 2020 election saw the highest turnout of voters in 120 years. And according to the Pew Research Center, 94% of Americans agree it is, quote, easy to vote. There is no widespread voter suppression in this country, and everybody knows it. In fact, voter registration disparities between minority and non-minority voters in states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana are below, listen, the disparities are below the national average and lower than Democrat-run states like New York, California, and Delaware. That's the facts. For Democrats, the only problem they're seeking to solve is the problem of how to secure for themselves more votes. Now, we've heard in New York, Democrats recently voted to allow foreign citizens to vote in American elections. You heard it right. It's a blatantly unconstitutional scheme that defies the most basic rule of our system. Hey, 7th grade civics, American elections should be decided by American citizens. New York's ridiculous new law has been challenged in court. We don't know what the outcome of that's going to be, but we can all take a stand here tonight to reaffirm to the people of this great nation that their legally cast votes will not be watered down and negated by the ballots of non-citizens. Madam Speaker, if the previous question is defeated, Republicans will amend the rule to provide for consideration of a resolution that acknowledges this simple truth. Allowing illegal immigrants and non-citizens to the right to vote devalues the franchise and diminishes the voting power of United States citizens. We all have an opportunity to go on record right here tonight to make our positions on that issue clear. I urge my colleagues to reaffirm the rights of U.S. citizens and vote no on the previous question. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 5746, which contains the text of H.R. 4, the so-called John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. With H.R. 4, Democrats are attempting to orchestrate yet another radical and unprecedented federal power grab over state-administered elections, this time under the guise of updating the Voting Rights Act. But the history here is so important. Upon its enactment in 1965, the VRA employed extraordinary measures to address pervasive state resistance to removing radically discriminatory barriers that did, at that time, prevent minorities from exercising their right to vote. But here's what's important. After exhaustive review in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court's Shelby County v. Holder decision recognized an obvious fact when examining the Voting Rights Act. Things have changed dramatically since 1965. Of course, that fact should be celebrated. The court reasoned that requiring states to pre-clear election law changes today based on conduct a half-century ago was an unconstitutional invasion of state sovereignty. Republicans are thrilled the VRA worked. The truth is that more Americans from minority communities are voting now than ever before, and overall voter registration remains sky high. In fact, voter registration disparities between minority and non-minority voters in states like Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Mississippi, Louisiana are below the national average, and get this, lower than Democrat-run states like California, New York, and Delaware. However, Democrats would have you think exactly the opposite. They want to bring pre-clearance back through HR4 and have all the states seek approval from Merrick Garland's Justice Department before they can make any changes to their election laws or redistricting, regardless of whether that jurisdiction has a history of discrimination or not. Again, this is a blatant federal power grab. These bills are contrary to the founders' intent, the plain text of the Constitution, and if they're fully implemented, they'll further erode Americans' faith in our confidence in our government institutions.